Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, and it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And in the American church world, one thing to make sense of is the rapid decline of the well-being of our pastors. Consider that in 2015, when the Barna Group conducted their annual research called the State of Pastors, they reported in 2015, 72% of pastors said that they felt very satisfied with their job as a pastor. By 2020, just 5 years later, that number had dropped to 67%. Then, as of 2022, just slightly over half, about 52% of pastors felt they were very satisfied with their jobs. Now, if you dig further into those numbers, there is this overwhelming sense, there's different factors in play, but there's this overwhelming sense that pastors feel like they're failing in their job. And there's the old truism, as your pastor goes, so goes your church. So it's clear that this is something that affects not just pastors, but all of us who are in the church world in one way or another. And even those of us who aren't, we are affected by the well-being of churches as an institution in our society. So we all have a vested interest in examining how is failure and success being experienced by pastors and churches? And what do we do about this growing sense of failure among many of our pastors? And to examine this question about failure and success in churches, I've got a great guest. It's Mark Turman, who's the executive director of the Denison Forum and vice president of Denison Ministries. Mark is most notably the host of the Denison Forum podcast, where I've had a chance to be a guest on a number of occasions and had some great conversations with Mark. He's also the chief strategist for Denison Forum Pastors, which equips pastors and church leaders to understand and transform today's culture. So, Mark, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. It's so great to have you.
Hey, Curtis, great to be on with you and great to be a part of this conversation and looking forward to where we're going to talk today.
So, Mark, we see the broad statistics from Barna, but you talk to and minister to pastors and church leaders. Give us the picture from the ground level. What's happening for our pastors?
Well, yeah, and it is hard. Well, first of all, just thanks, Curtis, for getting this conversation together. Excited to talk about this very real struggle that pastors are having. I've been that pastor, pastored 4 churches over 35 years, and just in the last couple of years, left the local church to start working in the ministry with Denison Forum and intersecting with people like you. So I've been that person, and the reality of it is pastoring's probably always been hard, but it's been particularly hard the last 10 years. And some of those reasons are obvious: political strife, obviously a global pandemic. I was talking to one of my pastor friends recently. He said, I've had a chance to talk to pastors all over the world. And his assessment was, pastoring's been difficult just about everywhere, but it's been harder in the United States because of some of the unique things that we have confronted, particularly things like political strife over the last 10 to 15 years. And so there's almost been like an X factor that seems to have applied to pastors in the United States. But it's been hard in other places as well. And then not only do you have the statistics that you cited from Barna, about just pastoral satisfaction, but you have the realities of church attendance, church participation, identification going down overall. And, it's the reality of it is we all have this mentality about our careers. Pastors have this mentality that if I'm doing a good job, then you will see the results in some ways. And for pastors, that's typically been, hey, there's more people coming to worship and coming to our small groups, participating in our ministries. Our finances are increasing. We're seeing more people being baptized as followers of Christ, more people engaging in other ministries that help them to grow as disciples and to participate in opportunities of service both inside and outside the church. And that's the way pastors, historically gauge themselves and gauge the health of the church. And a lot of those numbers, a lot of those statistics and measurements are not going in a positive direction right now. So it's very easy for pastors to be discouraged, and have some friends that work in this space a lot. One of the things that I always want to remind myself is many pastors will say that they're thinking about resigning or quitting or leaving the ministry, but that doesn't mean they are. It means that they're discouraged in their spirit enough that they're thinking about it, but most of them are staying in their churches and staying in their responsibilities. They just know that it's not very easy or very satisfying in this season.
Right. I think that's right. And I think that it should tell us something about the state of the broader church. If you've got a pastor that is so deeply discouraged, they are at least contemplating leaving, but still actually staying in there for a variety of reasons, that means you're being led, and the whole congregation is being led by somebody who is just really struggling. They're not sure that they really ought to be doing this. And there's just going to be this, all sorts of ways that this works out, whether it's lack of motivation or a sense of just discouragement that leaks out in one's sermon, in one's ministry. And so I think we really need to get at the root of this. There's clearly sort of multiple factors. There are, like you said, some short-term, or maybe they're not so much short-term, but they're more recent factors like politics, like the pandemic, that were like immediate stressors on it. There is this long-term de-churching that's going on that is broader than any one church, that is broadly happening throughout American society. In fact, broader modern Western society, refer to the really great book on this, The Great De-Churching. So that there's broad factors that we are swimming against the tide in so many ways. And then there's the specific ways that all these sort of immediate cultural factors and these long-term demographic factors then hit how pastors define success and failure. And so, Mark, I actually want to focus on this latter part that you've led us to, because I think, there's a lot of conversations we can have about politics, about our relationship to, sort of government regulations and so forth. There's a longer conversation we could have about the broader secularization and de-churching. But like I said, where this hits home for the pastor and for the congregation is how all of those factors, regardless of, all of them, the number and diversity of them, it's how it plays on the pastor's own sense of success or failure. So let's really zero in on that. Mark, you've said that, it's just the natural reality that pastors define success and failure by specific numbers that they can observe: attendance, giving, size of your facilities, so forth. Let's break that down. Has that always been the case? Or is there a history to that definition of success and failure?
Well, I think it's always been somewhat the history. Yes, numbers matter, and we do need to track some of those metrics because they do tell us something. But we shouldn't make that our idol. That should not be the sole criteria by which a church or a pastor or a leadership team in a church is measured. So the conversations from, if I'm looking at it from when I started in ministry in the mid 80s up to about 2010 or so, the conversation started to change and to say, you know what? Yes, there are indications. You look in the book of Acts, somebody was counting that there was 3,000 plus people saved and baptized on the day of Pentecost. And then there's some other markers like that you see through the book of Acts. And so you see some things, I used to tell my people on a regular basis, hey, we do count people and we count other things because, God wrote a book in the Bible called Numbers. He's all about numbers in some really good ways, but we don't idolize them. Okay. We can't say that tells us the whole story. In the same way that many people in various businesses or in government entities or in schools, you can't simply say because these numbers are positive or negative, that's never going to tell you the whole story. But it's very difficult. Jesus told us as Christians, as church leaders, as pastors, he told us to go make disciples. And if I have any questions when I get to heaven, Curtis, sometimes my first question is going to be, look, Jesus, you told me to go make disciples. How was I to know when I actually had one?
Yeah.
Was that going to be measured? How could I measure the
Right.
sin factor in my own life or in any family that I got to be the privilege of pastoring and caring for their soul? How could I know that they were actually sincerely and truly trusting in Jesus and that they were deepening that relationship?
Yeah.
How could I know anything about that?
Yeah.
That was insignificance. And so that's always been something of a mystery to me. I think it's a
Yeah.
mystery to many pastors, but that's also where the desire to kind of default to these numeric measurements
Yeah.
of attendance and finances and those kinds of things, that's where that comes in, is because we're wanting to have some sense that we are actually being obedient to the mission that God and Jesus invited us into, of being his co-workers and being on mission with him. So there is a sense that human beings need a sense of accomplishment.
Yeah.
Um, and how do you get that into the life of a pastor? And how does the church together do that, and not just the pastor doing it alone? That's part of the conversation as well.
Yes. And I want to just echo how I think every pastor struggles with this. That
Mm.
I know this was true in my own pastoral career, where you would tell yourself, I shouldn't care about the numbers, but you cared about the numbers. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just any pastor that tells you that battle is not going on inside them, I just start having some doubts about how self-aware or honest
Yeah.
that pastor is being. I remember this starts from a very early stage. I remember when I was in campus ministry, and I would say the most painful part of campus ministry for me would be on Friday nights when we would have our large group gathering of students. And students are notorious for showing up late to everything,
Mm.
right?
Hmm.
And so you would open up our large group service at 5 o'clock or at 7 o'clock. And you have a room booked for, let's say, 50 people, and there's 5 people there signing up. And then you're just at 7:01, 7:02, 7:03. And I'm sitting in the front because that's sort of where I'm about to speak. So I've got to sit in the front, but I'm just casting covert glances in the back and saying, okay, now there's 7, now there's 8, now there's 9, and now there's 12. And it was this sort of slow drip of trying to get your numbers up to some level that made you feel like, okay, this is worth it. This is okay. I'm okay. And I think I struggled with that better that was in my mid 20s, late 20s. I think I struggled with that better in my 30s as a pastor of a church, but that never went away. The backward glance to the room to see how much of the room is filled or empty, that never went away. And I just think that basic move never goes away for any pastor that's self-aware or self-honest. So Mark, given that, okay, what do we do with that? What do we do with that basic human reality that is there, especially in the face of these broad cultural, political, and demographic forces that say for the average pastor, when they do that backward glance, there's a good chance that room is going to look emptier than it did before.
We would always say, yes, there could be things we would do better and that we could improve upon. But the world has also changed a lot from the standpoint that there's been a lot of people and a lot of influences come into our culture that have made our country a mission field more than it ever has been. And in some ways, a more honest mission field. We go to some of the recent numbers about this group called the Nones, Nones.
Yeah.
One of the encouraging things, I think, from previous generations is there's no longer a lot of cultural value in being a Christ follower, to where you had all these people, particularly in the 40s, the 50s, they said they were Christian and they even showed up at church because there was social cultural value in doing that. People don't think that way by and large as much as they used to. And you see that in the numbers from 1990 to 2022, where people say, I don't go to church just for the sake of the relational or social involvement. I think there's something good about that, because that means we can have more honest conversations about where people really are spiritually. I've always been a person who just pursued relationships, not hundreds of them, but a handful of them. And from the earliest days when I felt called into ministry, I could sense that there were some people around me, and some of them were my peers, and others were either my student pastor or my senior pastor or some other people that I saw in leadership in church. I pursued those people just to get to know them, and what they became is, over the investment of time, most of them over lunches, but over the investment of time, they became safe harbors for me, where I sensed, again, this takes some effort, I sensed that I could actually start talking about some of my concerns and becoming more and more vulnerable with them. When I arrived in a Dallas suburb, which is where I helped plant a church and stayed at that church for 25 straight years, when I first got to town, I went to a denominational meeting. I come from a Southern Baptist root of faith, and I went to a denominational meeting that was local. I really didn't want to go, but I knew I needed to go just because I needed to represent my church in this environment. But I went and I met some other people, and I met a guy that was planting a church in the next community. There was something good about the fact that he was in the next town, not in my town. and I decided, and somebody suggested, hey, he's about a year ahead of you in planting a church. You ought to go and talk to him. I set up a meeting, and he and I joke about it now. When I talked to him for about an hour and a half one day when we first met, I walked to my car thinking, I never want to talk to him again, because it was a really hard conversation. He was having some struggles in his church, and I thought, man, he's kind of a bummer at this point. Why would I? But what happened out of that, Curtis, is we saw each other at a couple more meetings. We had another meeting over lunch, and I was with him just last night for 2 hours, because he and I have become the deepest of ministry friends and just partners. And we would both tell you now that if we didn't have our friendship and a few other friendships, both inside and outside our church, that we would have come apart in ministry a long time ago. Okay. But it started with investing in that relationship. And I tried that with other people. It didn't always happen with every person that I sought out, but it happened with enough people. And it started with a few people, 2 or 3, 4 people outside of my church and even outside of my town. So I could be safe with them. Yeah. And as we shared ministry struggles and stories, we realized that we were having a lot of the same experiences. And we could be open. We could, we could cry about it. We could scream about it. We could be very open and honest. That then led me to try to make some of those relationships within the leadership circles of my church. And again, Curtis, it took a lot of time. A lot of this building a sense that this person, I'm safe with this person, and I can share at a deep level with this person or 2 or 3 of these people, and they're not going to turn around and use that to harm me or my family. Yeah. But I had to invest time with them in what I call unscripted conversations. I would go and we go have lunch together or go have coffee together, and there was no agenda other than we're 2 believers who are trying to help lead a church, one as a pastor, one as a layman, and we're both concerned about the same things, and we're gonna grow our relationship to a place of relational capital and depth where we really can be honest. And what I started to find in that was, especially the other men that I was getting to know, is they were concerned about their careers. They were concerned about keeping their job. Even if they were working for a bank or they were running their own business or they were working in government, they had many of the same concerns. They just didn't apply it in the same way as I did within the context of a church.
Certainly, if you're a pastor, if you're listening to this, to be seeking that, but also really, if you are a lay person, maybe on the board, or maybe just somebody who's a involved person in your church, to be really seeking out your pastor, to be asking these questions. Maybe you are the one to provide that safe harbor voice, but if you're not, to be asking and encouraging your pastor, giving them permission to seek that. I think all that is great advice. I want to go one level deeper into this fear that you're talking about, that we all carry, that pastors carry around, that there, you said that there's a fear of failure that we've talked about, and also a fear of
Mm.
harm. Say more about what is the harm that pastors may be guarding themselves against. What does that look like?
Pastors are
And they're
just
fundamentally,
worried, hey, if I said something wrong in a sermon or a lesson, or I didn't minister to somebody when they were hurting as quickly or as deeply as that person thought, is that going to come around and turn up in a performance review
yeah,
that could end up ending my employment? And the second thing is it going to help? Is it going to harm me in some way, relationally? Am I going to lose friends over something I did or didn't do in trying to lead the church? Because church is a very emotion driven environment. Even if you come from a part of the church that is not particularly emotive, all of us are not only spiritually and mentally engaged, we're obviously emotionally and relationally engaged. And you're wondering, hey, if I make a hard decision because I think the church is being called by God to go in this way, and I really feel strongly that that's where I'm supposed to lead the church, because I am, as the pastor, a change agent and a leadership person. If I make that decision and people that I have long loved and cared for and been a part of their life, and they've been a part of mine at multiple levels, if they don't agree with me, how is
yeah,
that possibly going to impact my friendship with
yeah,
them? And one of the bottom line is, for me and for many I know, one of the hardest things is pastors know intuitively people are going to leave your church. They're going to join your church and they're going to leave your church. You know that intellectually. But when people that you are deeply invested in for years leave the church because you proposed an initiative, a building initiative or a mission initiative, and they didn't agree with it, and it became so significant that they exited the church and therefore exited relationship with you, that that is a level of hurt. And sometimes I don't think that hurt and harm are the same things, but it can become not just in a deep hurt, it can also become a form of harm, that is very, very damaging to many pastors. And we don't have a good structure for how people leave a church,
yeah.
and leave well when they feel like they need to.
Mark, you've been laying out sort of this sense of harm and fear that kind of grips pastors. You've laid out, I think, two. Economic fear of what happens if I lose this job, and then emotional fear of what happens if the relational damage occurs in this set of relationships I'm in. I want to zero in for a moment on this fear of economic harm, because it's something that I think is just not discussed with enough just honesty about. This was certainly true for me. Um, you that I think I stayed in pastoral ministry longer than I should have because of my fears of economic harm. When I look back upon my depression, uh, one way I characterize the depression that ended my pastoral career, it was like, the way I would put it would be, deep down, I knew this was not working for me, that this was
Mm.
not actually the right fit for me. But I felt like I couldn't do anything else. I don't know how many other pastors this is happening for at some level, but that statistic that we began with, where job satisfaction is so low, and yet we don't see actually droves of pastors quitting, suggests to me there's some percentage of those pastors who are not happy with their jobs, who are feeling like this isn't working out, but they feel trapped. They feel like,
Mm.
I can't do anything else. And that's a horrible place to be in psychically. It's a horrible place to be in spiritually, in all regards. Um, and so for me, and just to fill out the story one level more, it took a tremendous amount of just spiritual work and transformation for me
Mm.
to finally quit my role as a senior pastor and carve out this whole other career, as a consultant and as running my own consulting firm. That's a whole other story. Mark, it strikes me though that I was able to do that, but that was really, really hard. It took a lot of work,
Mm.
and I'm not sure that's the path for for every other pastor to think, okay, I'm going to go start my own consulting firm. Like that's not really a model, right?
Right.
So how say more about how pastors can actually deal with this little voice inside them that says you got to keep doing this even though it doesn't feel like it's working out because you can't do anything else.
I've known many of these folks and have walked with their journeys in many ways, both people that felt called out of other kinds of vocations and into ministry, but also people who were in ministry and things happened and they had a sense that they should stop serving inside the church as a vocational minister and transition out. I talked to one of the guys that became an elder in my church. When I first met him, he was the pastor of a church just outside of my town. And he sat down and did the hard work of saying, hey, if you were to take the things that I do in a church and you tried to put them into business language, what would that sound like? What words would you use? And it wasn't easy at first, but he went and got some career coaching in that way and said, help me translate the functions that I've been doing for the last 5 or 10 years into other language that somebody in business or somebody in education, somebody in some other field would be able to say, oh, okay, that is the same or very similar to this. But I really believe that there would never be a sense in which our loving and good God would want us to feel trapped, especially to the point of doing psychological and emotional harm to ourselves. He would never want that, right?
Yeah, no, and I did this exact same thing. I mean, I became a consultant and ran my own consulting firm because I was finally, and with the help of actually people in my church who were consultants themselves, who looked at what I was doing as a pastor and said, "Oh, you're not trapped. The skills of ministering to a people and helping them find their purpose, their identity, to diagnose what is preventing them from their desired vision for their life in Christ." When people ask me, do you miss ministry? Sometimes I answer, I don't, because I'm still in ministry. It's just that I'm ministering to secular organizations as a consultant versus to an individual or a individual church. And so I think that's exactly right. I think pastors would be helped by recognizing that so much of what they do does actually translate to other careers, which may not mean they actually make the step of leaving the pastorate to go pursue another career. But there's something about realizing you're not trapped, that you could leave, that I actually think is enormously freeing, because what it means is then you choose actively then to recommit to a pastoral career out of a sense of true calling, not out of being trapped. And that is a much more powerful and liberating posture to be in, to be free to choose rather than I'm trapped because I can't do anything else. And so I do encourage pastors to do that, even just imaginative exercise, and do it with trusted friends. And this probably may be outside of your church, so you don't freak people out. But to do this work, hey, every 5 years, ask, am I still called to this? Or maybe should I be doing something else? If I were to do something else, what would that be? And to really have a imaginative, creative exercise to explore, well, you could do this, you could do that. And I think that would, and again, even if that, and maybe ideally that exercise ends with a recommitment to ministry, but then it's a real choice. Mark, I want to transition to another topic though, about this idea of being trapped. So to how do we lift our eyes outside of this preoccupation with how big our numbers are, how much of our sanctuary is getting filled, to actually looking outside the sanctuary walls to the surrounding world and culture as a mission field. Talk more about that. How do we make this transition such that we get less preoccupied with our own numbers and our own budget, and more, how are we reaching the people outside the church? What needs to happen for this external transition?
Yeah, Curtis, thanks for asking. I think this is one of the real challenges in front of us as a church, particularly as the Western or American church, is that we've really been pushed into this mindset that there is a culture war that we have to win. And the longer I've thought about this is part of the reason Dr. Denison started the Denison Forum 15 years ago. It's what drew me to follow him, not only as a friend, but as a cultural apologist, talking about, hey, these things are going on in the world, and what's the right way and the right spirit that Christians need to be both aware and engaged around these kinds of things. And we all know that there are metaphors within the Bible that are militaristic in nature. But my more recent thinking on this is okay, if we were to win the culture war, how would we know that we won it? What would that even look like? In you know, would that mean that there's always a Billy Graham type figure that is the president of our country or something like that? What would that mean? And it's very hard to come up with a really good definition because the only real true king is going to be Jesus when he comes back and sets all things right. The world is going to be broken in substantial ways until that day comes. And it's going to be broken out in the world and hopefully less so in the church, but it's going to be broken in the church as well. Because none of us is going to be fully sanctified until we are with Jesus personally and collectively. It's just going to be that reality. And so I think we've overemphasized this us and them mentality. No question, there are real problems and there are real dangers, and there are real dangers to our faith in terms of our opportunity to freely engage our faith as our country's been founded on. There are real things to think about that and to be concerned about it. But I think the mentality that God has led me to understand the last couple of years is you're not called to be a cultural warrior. You are called to be a cultural missionary, to be engaging the community around you that God has allowed you to be a part of, to engage that in a way that brings the fruit of the Spirit into those conversations and into those situations, and that seeks to extend the message of Christ by both example and by word when the opportunity to speak comes. And that we ought to be doing that anywhere and everywhere, especially in the communities where our churches are planted. That we are a part of a worldwide network called The Church, and our church in our town is a significant, important part of that, regardless of how big or small it is. It has an opportunity to bring the fruit of the Spirit through every individual member and through the collective efforts of those members in that community to feed the poor or help the sick or provide for the homeless or take care of single moms or to try to engage and interrupt if they discover that there's a sex trafficking experience going on, whatever it might be going on in their town.
Yeah.
That we bring our message as missionaries. And then, Curtis, real quick, just missionaries understand that they're not there to fight a war. They're there first to serve and to speak. But that can also at times lead to places of sacrifice where Christians and churches need to, they need to not do this because they're going to do that with their resources or with their time. And on occasions, the Bible would clearly tell us that sometimes means we may suffer.
Yeah.
And what seems to be really unwelcome in the large conversation of what's unfashionable in the American church is the idea of serving, of speaking the truth in love, as the Bible says, and also being willing to sacrifice our resources, our time, our money, our attention, to be willing to sacrifice and, if necessary, suffer. We seem to be uninterested in that. We're kind of bored with that kind of idea. And we need to come back to examples like Daniel, who, Daniel gets carted off to a whole nother country, but holds on to his faith and decides, you know what, I didn't want to be here, but I am going to stay as faithful as I can to God in the midst of this environment.
Mark, I want to pull on some threads of what you're talking about that personally resonate with me. In particular, your call for churches and pastors to have this missionary mindset, to be out there, not fighting a war against the broader culture, but actually serving and engaging, and therefore involved in the wider culture around us, the
Mm.
wider secular culture. I know for myself that um, when that happened, uh, in a major turning point for me was actually when I left being a pastor.
Mm.
That when I left being a pastor and I started my own consulting firm that serves secular nonprofits, that's when I made a major leap forward in actually this missionary mindset, because it got me in the world. It got me in relationships with the secular leaders, secular organizations. I ended up having much more evangelistic conversations as the head of a consulting firm than I ever did as a senior pastor. I mean, that's just the truth. And the reality is because I was spending so much more time as a missionary out in the world than I was a pastor, because as a pastor, most of my job was keeping what would happen within the sanctuary walls going, funded, healthy, fed, and all of that's good. Somebody needs to do that. But all I know is the way things were set up was that when I was a pastor, all of the incentives and imperatives set up around me was to keep my eyes focused on what happened within the sanctuary walls, that it was filled up with good stuff and good numbers. And that it was only when I left being a pastor that I really grew dramatically in my missionary mindset. There seems to be something fundamentally wrong with that picture, Mark. And so I want to explore just this idea that I've had and get your feedback, that I think we need to experiment more and more with bivocational pastors, where built into your very job is actually life outside the church wall. I mean, and by that I mean the job, not just your free time, but the stuff that is paying the bills, actually takes you outside of the church walls. And this is not a radical new model. I mean, ethnic churches, if you go around America, that is the standard model, actually, is these sort of bivocational pastors, because they actually don't have the economic base to actually fund a full-time pastoral, either individual or pastoral team. And I wonder if this would have some dual benefits, this model. One, if for the pastor, him or herself, it really grows their missionary mindset because they're regularly exposed to life outside the sanctuary. And two, I think there's something that happens when your business model is based on generating a large enough user base and contributor base so that it can support a full-time pastor. And frankly, not just a full-time pastor, because if you're a full-time pastor, what you really want is other full-time pastors around you. You want a team around you, so you're not doing all of the work. So the moment you start thinking, I need a professional pastoral class whose annual paycheck is completely funded by the ministry world, you are immediately channeled into a way of thinking about church where you've got to get numbers up to a certain number and a certain giving size such that it can actually support that full-time professional class of ministers. And so, Mark, help me flesh it out for me. Do we think that we need to actually learn from small ethnic churches, and by we I mean the dominant culture, white evangelical sort of culture, if you want, learn more from our brothers and sisters in our ethnic churches, and really lean more into this bivocational ministry model? What do you think of that?
Well, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I certainly wouldn't begrudge anybody that is in a full-time church position. Sure. Yeah. But the same dynamic works, right, for people that are working for a singular company, right? And you're worried, hey, if this company's stock price goes down and they start imposing personnel cuts, how far is that going to go? People in other professions have that same kind of narrow reality.
All your eggs are in that basket.
All your eggs are in that one basket. And people are even starting to learn, watching this in some of my own family members, of diversifying where your financial and economic support come from becomes liberating, because then you're like, well, if that doesn't work out, I at least have this over here, and I'm somewhat diversified. And we all know that there's strength in that. I know one church planter up in the New England area, where every staff member, both himself and every staff member that he hired, he said, I'm going to only hire you to be a 2/3 employee. Yeah. Everybody that works at this church has to go get an outside job, what he called a side hustle, that would not, it's not, we're not asking people to work 80 hours a week by having two jobs.
Yeah.
We're saying to them, we want you to, for a couple of reasons. One, we don't have the economic ability to support, 3, 4, 7 staff members full time. We just don't have it.
Yeah.
But we also, it creates a different kind of mindset. What you referenced a minute ago, it creates a different mindset, and it causes us to relate to people who are hopefully going to come into our church.
Yeah.
We're able to understand their lives a little bit better because we now experience some of what they experience. If we're working at the coffee shop, the way some of them do, or we work at the clothing store, the grocery store, or, we get trained and we become a part-time healthcare giver. We start to understand their world a little bit more. And, no less a person than the Apostle Paul, most of the apostles and others in the Bible, this is the way that they did their lives.
Yeah, that's right.
One of the things, Curtis, I did as I was a full-time pastor, again, across 3 different churches. My first church was a bivocational situation. I worked in a bank while I pastored this church. And in some ways I was glad for that, right? Because it gave me another world to use my skills and to sense that I could actually contribute to an organization in addition to contributing what I was doing with the church. And so I was getting not only dual levels of financial and economic support for my family, I was getting 2 levels of experience and affirmation to my giftedness in these 2 different environments. What did I do when I got into a full-time job? Well, when I got to the place I served the longest, I said, I got invitations to join the civic clubs, the Lions Club and the Rotary Club and all that. I went and visited those organizations. They do great things. They're great people. But I started looking around the room and I realized, Curtis, these people are all church leaders. And probably 90% of these people already know Jesus and they already have an active relationship with him and they're involved in churches. So I could just go hang out with more church people by being in the civic club. So I started looking around and I realized the one place in my community that seemed to draw all different kinds of people together was the Chamber of Commerce. You didn't have to, the only qualification to be a part of the Chamber of Commerce was to pay your annual fee and to have a business in town or to work for a business in town. And I just went and got involved in that environment. I proved the point that in the Chamber of Commerce in my town, just like at church, if you show up often enough, they think you know something and they put you in charge. And so they actually let me become the chairman of the board over a period of time. I was involved with the chamber for 10 plus years. But to what you were saying, Curtis, I got to meet people who were not in anybody's church and had various levels of spiritual understanding from 0 to a lot. And I got to have conversations with people I likely would have never gotten to meet or to know or to talk with if I had stayed singularly focused on just keeping my church going, which took a lot of effort and was very important. But I had to carve this out so that I could get around other people and I could experience it. It allowed me to experience what my people coming on Sunday morning to listen to me preach. I could relate to them much better because I learned some of the rhythms of the community, some of what happens if you work for the city in a government role, if you work for the school district, if you work for the fire department, if you work for a small or a medium or a large company. All of those things are unique and have some differences, but there's also a whole lot of similarities. And more than once I went home going from a Chamber of Commerce event or some kind of business gathering going, this sounds just like church.
Yeah.
Totally. People are people, people are people.
Well, Mark, this has been a great conversation. And I just want to encourage our pastors who are listening and the people who go to church and are being served by and are trying to serve their pastors to try to glean something from this, because I think experiences of failure or seeming failure are always an opportunity. They're always an invitation from God to rethink, to re-examine. And whether it's a process for a pastor to re-examine, am I still called to this? And to actually be free to ask, maybe there's something else I can do. And a process that may end up leading you to recommit, but recommit out of a sense of choice and not a sense of being trapped. Or maybe it's you're going to stay as a pastor. Maybe you're going to actually try to experiment with a bivocational model. Now is the time to do this. This is the moment for us to lean into new models. Or maybe if you are just going to be the pastor of a church with a pastoral team in the traditional professional class, I'm not saying that's wrong at all. But let's experiment within that model. Borrow from Mark's example. Can we write into our job descriptions for everybody on the team, from the youth worker to the child care provider to the senior pastor? Can we work into everybody's job description? I don't know, 15% of your time, half a day is actually needs to be spent outside the church walls, outside the walls of the ministry, as a missionary into the world. And that's part of your job. That's part of your job description at every level of your church. I think this is the moment for us to be rethinking all of our old, well-worn paths of what professional ministry looks like, because I think this is the moment for that God is calling the church to experiment, to be bold, to rethink our old wineskins. So, Mark, thank you for helping us do that. It's been really a pleasure, and it's been long overdue for you to come on the Good Faith podcast like this.
Well, thank you, Curtis. It's been a real privilege, and look forward to future conversations as well.
And listeners, please remember to rate us on wherever you get our podcast. Please write a review. Those reviews really help give new potential listeners who are checking us out a sense of who we are. So please take the extra 2 minutes to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. And then remember, once again, next week, we will gather again around the campfire.